Okay, perhaps we can start now. But before we start and introduce our speakers, I'd just like to draw to your attention the Energy Briefing 2014, which John has put together with a lot of assistance from people in the BusinessNZ Energy Council, and it takes a good look at our system for the new generation of politicians that are coming here, and looks at a system which is working reasonably well, looks at its strengths and weaknesses, and looks at what we do to make sure that we maintain a good energy system within New Zealand, and the things that need to be done. And so I commend you to read this, and hopefully it'll be a valuable document for us in the months and even years to come. There are copies outside when you leave, if you'd like to take them with you. And just to thank John for all the effort he's put into that. I think it's quite timely we have Brent Alderton and Nick Russ from the Commerce Commission here to talk to us today, and particularly the subject they're going to be talking about around regulation, particularly in the electricity sector. It's a timely discussion. Hopefully it won't be too topical, so you will be able to talk about about things. I think it's important because it really touches on all three aspects of the energy trilemma. Energy sustainability, clearly we need a good electricity network to be able to allow us to introduce a full range of renewables into the electricity system. Energy security, we've seen the importance of electricity networks in energy security in the past couple of weeks, and energy affordability. And as I was coming into town this morning, there was a debate where quite different views were expressed by somebody from Contract Energy and somebody from the Marlborough Lines Company about what were the components of the rising cost of energy. So energy affordability is one of the critical issues. We're seeing it becoming highlighted more in our World Energy Council Issues Survey that we've done in New Zealand, and so it's interesting to see how the Commerce Commission can impact on this. So with that, I've probably said enough, and I'd like to open the floor to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, good afternoon, and thanks for the introduction, Rob, and thank you to John for organising today. So it's a bit difficult to know where to stand exactly here, but I'll stand to one side. So Nick Russ is with me today. He is the head of the Part 4 and dairy area. For those of you who don't know, Part 4 of the Commerce Act regulates the electricity lines and gas pipeline services. Just one caveat before I start. There are processes going on within the Commission that are live now, and we can't discuss today, and we won't be able to take questions on those. So I apologise in advance. If you ask me a question about something that is live and there's a process on at the moment, I won't be able to answer that, but we'll do our best to answer any other questions that you have at the end. The other thing is that we have slanted this presentation towards a business audience. So we thought that given the majority of you are here representing business, that is Business New Zealand Energy Council, that's where we would focus the attention today. But obviously consumers are a central part of what we do, and consumers include both residential and businesses. So just thought I'd make that clear. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Commission, a little bit about competition and the Commission. I'm going to talk about WACC, and I can see Jeremy Kane smiling. But we're not going to cover the esoteric world of the Brennan-Lally capital asset pricing model, or market risk premium, or asset betas, or anything like that. What we're going to talk about is why we're reviewing it. And there's a lot of information and misinformation, I think, around that. So I'd like to talk about, from the Commission's perspective, why we have embarked on that work. Nick then will talk about electricity and gas sector regulation, more into the Part 4 area, some of the current work without going into the processes, and some of the emerging challenges that the Commission is facing in undertaking its work. So just a little bit of background. Some of you will be very familiar with the Commission, others of you may not be. So the Commerce Commission in New Zealand is our competition agency and our economic regulator. There are two core parts to the Commission. There's the competition side, which deals with both consumer and competition matters. And then there's the regulation area, and that's the area we're going to focus most on today. And you can see that the Commission has responsibility for the regulation of electricity lines, gas pipelines and airports, the three international airports, Wellington, Auckland and Christchurch, telecommunications and dairy. So telecommunications and dairy are dealt with under separate legislation. The electricity, gas and airports is under Part 4 of the Commerce Act. In some in some countries overseas, you'd see some of these functions in different agencies. But in New Zealand, they're all together in the Commerce Commission. And from our perspective, that makes sense. It means we have economies of scale for a country of this size. It allows us to attract high quality staff. And the decision made some time ago was to have these functions together. So what are we all about? We have two objectives. The first is to achieve the following for New Zealanders. Markets are more competitive and consumers' interests are protected. So that's on the competition side. In the regulation area, the performance of regulated suppliers and markets provide for the long-term benefit of consumers. So everything we do is aimed at contributing to those objectives. In the competition area, we enforce and provide information in relation to the Fair Trading Act, the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, Part 2 of the Commerce Act, which is around cartels and unilateral conduct, and Part 5 of the Commerce Act, which is around mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of the Commission's work is around the clearances and so on for merger applications. In the regulation area, I've already covered that, but it is the Commerce Act, the Telecommunications Act, and the Dairy Industry Structuring Act. So it's quite a broad reach for the organisation. It covers a wide range of areas. And as I say, the two main areas, competition, including consumer, and regulation. So I thought I'd just touch a little bit on the benefits of competition. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but we know that competition is a key driver for delivering greater productivity and growth in the economy. Competition incentivises firms to innovate, and the competitive process rewards efficient businesses. And I think it's important to remember that through regulation, what we're trying to do is mimic the competitive outcomes in markets where there's little or no competition. So we know that competition's good, we know that it produces some outcomes that are desirable from the perspective of the economy, and what we're trying to do in the areas where we can't have competition or don't have competition is achieve the same sorts of outcomes. A World Bank publication in 2012 stated that competition in domestic markets affects the international competitiveness of national firms. Firms typically acquire many of their inputs, whether that's transport, energy, telecommunications or financial services, in local markets. And if these upstream markets lack competition, goods and services needed for production are not priced competitively. As a result, firms may be less competitive than their foreign rivals and domestic GDP growth may suffer. So that's why competition is important. From our perspective, a large part of it is around productivity. So what are we trying to achieve as an agency? What sort of impact should we be having? So an effective competition agency and regulator ensures there's a level playing field for competitors. The rules are known and the players are monitored. Market power is not abused. The level of competition in a market is not substantially lessened by amalgamation. So I said a large part of the Commission's work is around merger applications and whether they should proceed or not. Consumers are protected and clear and accurate information is provided to them. So that's the Fair Trading Act work. Regulated businesses face incentives to perform, invest and provide long-term benefits for consumers. So that's the regulatory parts under Part 4 and telecommunications. But the opposite could be true in the absence of an effective agency. So where you don't have an effective agency, you have the opposite of those effects. And the same World Bank paper that I mentioned just a moment ago notes, cross-sector studies reveal that antitrust enforcement has a significant positive effect on productivity growth. And further, it is not the existence of the competition rules, but their effective enforcement that matters most for economic performance. So that's the impact that we're trying to have as an agency. So what I'm going to talk about now is the weighted average cost of capital. And if you're not an expert in weighted average cost of capital, that's fine. And I'm only going to talk about it as it relates to electricity lines and gas pipeline businesses. But just to remind you of what we're trying to achieve. As I said, we know that competition drives desirable economic outcomes and behaviour when the rules are clear and they're fairly enforced. And we also know that electricity lines and gas pipelines are natural monopolies, so they don't face effective competition. But we still want the benefits that competition brings. We still want the innovation, we still want investment, we want price pressure, we want rewards for efficiency, and we want improved quality. So that's what we're trying to get out of this regime. So I thought it would be helpful just to remind you what's in Part 4 of the Commerce Act. I'm not a lawyer, okay? But when I look at this, I see a few things. So that's the purpose statement. The first thing that jumps out to me is, why do we have this? Well, we have it to promote the long-term benefit of consumers. What do we want? We want outcomes that are the same outcomes that are produced in a workably competitive market. And what else did Parliament want? So Parliament says that that's what they want, and they want the suppliers to have incentives to invest and innovate. They want the suppliers to have incentives to improve efficiency and to provide services at a quality that reflects consumer demands. I've paraphrased this slightly, but it is accurate. They want the efficiency gains that the suppliers produce to be passed through and to be shared, including through lower prices. And they want to ensure that the suppliers are limited in their ability to extract excessive profits. So you can see that's the framework that the Commission is having to weigh up every day. And you can see that some of those are in conflict with each other, and it is a balancing act. Part 4 of the Commerce Act regulates the price and quality of electricity line services, transmission and distribution, gas pipeline services, transmission and distribution, and specified services at the international airport. So that's what Part 4 applies to. So when Part 4 was brought in, one of the key things that Parliament was looking for was greater certainty for suppliers and for consumers in relation to the rules, requirements and processes that were going to apply to the regulation. So they said, Commission, you need to specify what they called input methodologies so that the regulated businesses knew the rules of the road. So they said, you need to specify these things in some detail to give businesses and consumers some certainty about how this is going to work. They said, cost of capital, you need to specify an input methodology for that, how you go about valuation of assets, how you're going to allocate costs between, say, the regulated and the unregulated part of a business, how you're going to think about the treatment of tax, pricing methodologies, and then the rules and processes around what you do. And after more than 2 years of working with the industry and consumer groups, we specified those input methodologies at the end of 2010. Now, as I said, the cost of capital was one of those. So the cost of capital is basically the return that you can get on your regulated asset base. And the cost of capital is always a contentious parameter in regulation. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about the process that's on now, but I want to talk about how we got to the decision to go ahead with the review. So all of our input methodologies were subject to merits review. There were appeals by both the regulated suppliers and consumer groups, and the High Court heard those appeals assisted by a couple of lay members. The Court rejected all appeals in relation to the cost of capital. That is, the Commission's input methodologies as specified in relation to the cost of capital were unchanged. The Commission, though, in doing that work, had to make a call when you calculate the cost of capital, it produces a range. And the Commission had to make a call on where it set the regulated cost of capital within that range. And it set it at the 75th percentile because it didn't want to disincentivise investment, if you think about those objectives that I had set out before. The major energy users group argued that it should have been at the 50th percentile. But the court didn't agree with that. So they said, we dismiss the appeal, it stays at the 75th. But in doing that, they did make some comments. I'd just like to go through that. Because from where we were, these comments created uncertainty. And if you remember what Parliament was trying to achieve at the start of this, it was really about trying to create certainty. So the court noted that the outputs of regulated suppliers are inputs to numerous, probably all other sectors of the economy, as well as being used by final consumers. If the prices paid by user industries are higher than the resource cost of producing the outputs, then inefficiency is promulgated through the economy. So the court thought that this was important, and what was going on here affects the whole economy. They then went on to say, in our view, applying the 75th percentile estimate to the initial regulatory asset base is unlikely to be necessary to promote incentives to invest and innovate. And further, they said, in reaching our decision not to amend, so they chose to stay with the Commission's decision, in respect of the 75th percentile, we are mindful that the input methodologies will be reviewed. And at that time, we would expect that our scepticism about using a cost of capital substantially higher than the midpoint will be considered by the Commission. So that's what the court said. And it was against that backdrop that Consumer New Zealand, the Employers and Manufacturers Association, and MEUG wrote to the Commission seeking an urgent review of its decision to use the 75th percentile. They were concerned that if it wasn't done now, i.e. this year, ahead of the reset for the regulatory instrument that applies to electricity lines and gas pipeline businesses, that is the default price quality path, if it wasn't done now, it would have to wait until 2020, which is the next reset. So the Commission then consulted on the desirability of the review. So given the initial uncertainty created by the High Court judgment and the request of the business and consumer groups, the Commission consulted on the 75th percentile WACC estimate for the lines businesses and whether it should be carried out before the reset in December this year. And effectively, we were trying to assess the costs, such as heightened short-term uncertainty for the regulated businesses, versus the benefits that would come from undertaking such a review now. And the feedback through the consultation process on whether the Commission should undertake the review in 2014 was polarised. Won't be surprised given the purpose statement. On the one hand, the regulated businesses submitted strongly against the review. So, as an example, the ENA, the Electricity Networks Association, on behalf of its members, submitted that while the fact that legislated periodic input methodologies reviews will always create a possibility that new information or evidence may change the practice of adopting the 75th percentile, an unscheduled review creates uncertainty. So they were saying that the regime foresees that you will go about reviewing these things on a periodic basis, but actually doing it in an unscheduled way creates unnecessary certainty. PowerCo submitted that we do not believe that the review of the WACC input methodology is appropriate at this time, and proceeding with an out-of-cycle review of one aspect of the input methodologies will create, rather than reduce, regulatory uncertainty. So that was one side of the debate. The other side was a number of parties that submitted in favour of the review. For example, Fonterra, Carter Holt Harvey, Windstone Pulp, Air New Zealand, Contact Energy. This is Carter Holt's, or part of Carter Holt's submission. They said electricity and gas is our highest input cost after wood, and affects our ability to compete in the international market. Its price affects our ability to compete in the international market. It's essential to the viability of our operations that electricity is obtained at a fair and reasonable price, and effectively Carter Holt supports an urgent amendment to the cost of capital input methodologies to change the specification from the 75th percentile to the midpoint. So really what I want to demonstrate is how we've got to the point of actually making the decision to go ahead. So there is a lot of debate around this. It is driven by, in large part, the purpose statement, which requires the Commission to weigh up a range of competing objectives. There is a range of views. On the one hand, the regulated businesses are saying doing this out of order, Commission, creates uncertainty. And on the other hand, businesses that rely heavily on electricity as an input to their productive processes are saying this is so important it should be dealt with now. And if it's not dealt with now, it won't be able to be dealt with till 2020. So I thought it would be helpful just to give you an idea of the sorts of things that the Commission has to try and balance up in doing its work. As I say, there is a lot of debate around this in and around the process, and the final decision will be released at the end of this month. So I'm going to hand over to Nick now. He can go through electricity and gas sector regulation. I'm happy to take any questions on that if I can at the end, remembering that it is a live process and so I am limited in what I can say. But thanks.
So as Brent has already set out earlier, these are the regulated industries that we look after in the regulation branch of the Commerce Commission. And what we're really talking about today, more specifically, is probably electricity line services and to a lesser extent gas pipe services, because they're covered by very similar regulation. And as always been set out, under Part 4 it also covers airport services. And it also has the option of us undertaking an inquiry into other markets where there's issues around competition to see if regulation would be of a benefit. Sorry, this is very acronym heavy. I'll try and explain these just very once over lightly about the kind of regulatory tools we have available under Part 4. For the gas businesses and the non-consumer owned electricity distribution businesses, they're subject to price quality regulation. And the mechanism we have for that is known as default customised price quality path, or default price quality regulation. The way it works is we have a default price path, which is a low-cost methodology that takes account of sort of generic information and is applied to everyone. And it doesn't take necessary account of all the company's specific circumstances, so it might not be fit for purpose for everyone. So the way that works is if a company does not think that the default price quality path is suitable for them, they're able to apply for a customised price path, and there's a process around that that allows it to be tailored to their individual circumstances. And that's something that Orion did in response to the Canterbury earthquakes, as the DPP was no longer sort of fit for purpose given their circumstances, and they were able to come in for a more customised price path. In the case of Transpower, they've got what's known as an individual price quality path. It's a lot like the CPP, it's just guaranteed that they have one that's specifically tailored to Transpower and their circumstances. So all the businesses that are captured under Part 4 regulation are subject to information disclosure. So that also includes the consumer-owned EDBs, which aren't subject to price quality regulation through their consumer ownership. They're exempted, but they are subject to information disclosure. The purpose of information disclosure is basically for interested parties to have access to information basically about how the businesses are performing and how well those objectives of the purpose of Part 4 are being achieved that Brent set out earlier. Are the companies investing and innovating? Are they achieving efficiencies? Are they providing the right levels of quality? And are they earning appropriate returns and not earning excessive profits? The Commission also has an obligation to undertake some summary analysis of that information. So that's really, again, assisting stakeholders. This information is disclosed by the businesses, and then the Commission basically tries to understand how the companies are performing and how that performance has changed over time and how they're performing relative to each other. And finally, Part 4 does set out the option of negotiate arbitrate regulation, but that is it's not currently used. What we're really talking about today is probably the companies are subject to price quality regulation. And that's where we put a limit on their prices, or how their prices can change over time, and we also put in place quality standards as well. Fundamentally, it breaks down to some very key inputs about how we do that. The way we set the price path, it's really around the expectations the company will be able to earn a normal return, or expectations they'll be able to earn a normal return. So that's very heavily dominated by how we value their assets, which is known as the RAB, the regulatory asset base. And that is set out in these input methodologies that sort of set out the rules and processes in advance that make it very clear how the assets will be valued. In terms of having expectations of a normal return, we have to agree what a normal return is. And that again is set out in the input methodologies around the weighted average cost of capital. And then the other big input to the revenue the businesses need is how much they will spend on the network, both the CapEx and the OpEx. And these things broadly come together, which is described in a building blocks methodology to figure out the appropriate amount of revenue a company will need. And that's set up in advance for a 5-year period. We also have to set quality standards as well. There's a risk as soon as you constrain someone's ability to increase their prices, the way they can increase profit is by compromising on quality. So there's requirements to set both a price path and a quality path. So in terms of our current work, we're right in the final stages of setting the price quality paths for both Transpower and for the distribution businesses. So for the distribution businesses, it's a default price quality path, a DPP, which will run for the 5 years from 2015 to 2020. And the same for Transpower under the individual price quality path, the IPP, which will run for the same period. So unfortunately, what the timing has meant, there's quite a peak in the Commission's workload doing both of these resets at the same time. And as Brent said, that both will take account of the WACC, which will be determined before the end of October. These resets are major projects for the Commission. In terms of my team, almost everyone in my area is working on either one of these 2 resets or the review of the WACC percentile. So these are significant undertakings for the Commission. They come around every 5 years, but in practice it has meant we've had to defer and a number of other areas of work where they've received less focus. But importantly, that's going to be changing from the new year. Once these resets are completed, we really want to be moving on to increase focused on compliance. So that's both proactively working with the businesses to provide assistance about what they need to do in order to comply, and also taking any necessary compliant actions where companies haven't complied with their requirements. And that's both for the price quality path and for the information disclosure requirements. Another key area of focus going forward will be understanding performance. Now that information disclosure has been in place for a number of years, the information is becoming available to really start understanding how these companies are performing, and that's will be a key focus of the Commission over the coming years. So probably what main focus I would like to talk today about is some of the emerging challenges that we face, or the industry really faces, and how the regulator is thinking about these things and what we're likely to have to deal with. One thing that's probably worth highlighting is the price paths are kind of a fit and forget. In order to provide certainty for the business, they've set in advance for 5 years, and apart from sort of some very specified circumstances, they can't be reopened and re-looked at. So what it means in practice is a lot of these emerging challenges aren't really going to have an impact on the price path from the point of view of the regulation until 2020. The kind of exception for that is there is reopener provisions to deal with kind of extreme events such as major earthquakes, or in the case of the distribution businesses, they have the option of a CPP if they think there's something that should be modified to be more tailored to their specific circumstances. So there's a couple of mechanisms for dealing with some of these issues during the period, but for a majority of businesses, these issues will really come to the head for the next reset, which will happen or will need to be complete by 2020. So some of these emerging challenges, these are probably consistent with what you hear around the world, internationally, as well as what's been talked about in New Zealand. There's a lot of talk about what's going on with demand. Is it flattening out, declining? What's going to happen in the future? What's happening with TY? What's happening with energy efficiency and energy intensity of domestic consumers? So there's always been uncertainty around future demand, but there's probably a question whether that's becoming more uncertain going forward. And probably a lot of that has to do with some of the potential disruptive technologies that's out there, particularly solar PV and electric cars. When will they arrive and what impact will they have on demand? There's probably some other disruptive technologies out there that aren't necessarily impacting on demand, but will impact on the networks and how they operate. Smart networks, smart meters, what they will mean in terms of technology and the way that the grid will be designed and operated. As we heard in the introduction, there's an increasing focus around the affordability of electricity and what that will mean for, I guess the way of talking about that is about fuel poverty, where people are spending increasingly higher percentages of their household incomes on energy. And I think the way that this is sort of characterised potentially both internationally and New Zealand is there's a risk that you can get in what is referred to as a death spiral, where as these prices increase, people switch off the network, potentially invest in PV. It means there's less people using the network to spread the costs over, so prices have to increase. As prices increase further, more and more people move off the network, and you can potentially get into this vicious cycle of prices going up and less people to spread the costs over. And that's something that's being sort of faced all around the world, particularly for electricity networks. There's probably a lot of changing consumer expectations, both around quality and reliability. Probably not so much everyday reliability, that we seem to be getting the feedback majority that's reasonably good in New Zealand. The main issue seems to be resilience and the impact of the major events. There's been the Maui gas pipeline interruption a couple of years ago. There's been various interruptions on Transpower's network. There's been a lot of sort of wind storms over the last couple of years, and then obviously more recently what happened in Penrose. So consumers are probably having to think about not just their day-to-day reliability, but their exposure to the network and how resilient they would like it to be and what they're prepared to pay for. There's probably also changing expectations of how they engage with the network. Particularly if you're looking at alternative generation sources, about injecting back into the network, buyback rates, and if the network's only there for a backup, how would they pay for that? And just different expectations of how they'll engage with the network, and they're moving from probably being passive to active in terms of how they interact with the energy sector. There's probably also changing expectations around the business model and who they're engaging with, just simple things about bundling up services or energy service providers, providers of demand side management. There's probably new business models out there that have yet to come to customers have yet to see this, but it could be changing going forward. And then this is also against the backdrop of potentially increasing sort of magnitude and frequency of extreme events around climate change. We do hear a lot from the companies about the number of, say, wind events that have been happening in the last few years, and that's obviously going to impact on the networks as well. So ultimately, all these things really beg the question: is this increasing uncertainty? Is this something that everyone's always had to face when you operate these networks, or is this something that's increasing in light of all these sort of developing areas? So it sort of presents a few key questions, not just to the industry, but also to us as regulators. Fundamentally, our starting point is, what will it mean for consumers? But you can't really answer that question until you start unpicking, or what's actually going on. What will all these changes mean for the role of the networks? Are they still going to be providing the same function they do currently, or is that likely to evolve? Simply, will that mean more, less, or different assets? What's, in terms of forecasting investment, how do we understand what's the right investment, what's the right type of investment, and what's the right timing? What role will innovation play? How are these networks going to evolve, and how is the disruptive technology going to impact on the way the networks are operated? Fundamentally, will there be competition? Will these networks continue to be monopolies? If something like a domestic solar PV becomes comparable or more comparable with the price of grid-generated electricity, will the networks effectively face competition? And this is all, so what does it mean for regulation? How will regulation have to evolve to take account of this? And then it's all very easy to have a whole list of questions, but whose task is it? Who is really going to be prioritising actually taking the lead in answering these questions? And just to reiterate from our point of view, ultimately what the consumers are going to be interested in, what it really means for price and quality. In terms of our expectations, I think it's important that it's the transparent and the distribution businesses that take the lead in understanding the impacts on their network. This is what their business is, and it's really their role to manage this risk and uncertainty, and they're the real expertise about what the impacts will actually be on the networks. So what does that mean in terms of practice and what the Commission is expecting? Well, there's already an obligation on these companies to produce long-term business plans and disclose them publicly. We refer to these as AMPs, asset management plans. We'd expect to start seeing over time some of these issues being addressed in these plans, how the businesses propose to deal with these issues. I guess we'd expect some sort of scenario option modelling. We know in the UK there's a model called the transform model that was developed for a very similar purpose, to understand how smart networks would evolve and the cost benefits of different options and what disruptive technology is likely to have an impact on the network. There's lots of very positive work going on around industry working groups and the Smart Grids Forum that a lot of the industry members of, as well as the Commission. John Hamill represents the Commerce Commission on that group. And our expectations also extend to the businesses engaging with Commission processes, but also being proactive. Like, we're very interested to be kept in the loop in what's going on, welcome to understand what industry's thinking, where they're getting to and dealing with these issues, and really want to be sort of part of understanding how this unfolds. Conscious there's a lot of live consultations and processes and train at the moment, so sort of any comments to make now are just general observations around the sort of feedback we're getting from the sector for our general engagement, particularly from, when I say industry here, I mean the monopoly businesses. Very much around uncertainty increasing, and lots of their suggestions about ways of dealing with this is really kind of can be summarised as a higher WACC, greater OPEX allowances or new pass-through costs, or bringing forward cash flows, albeit in an NPV neutral way, so accelerated depreciation, for example. I think it's pretty obvious, but all of this would just lead to higher prices now. So what it's sort of saying, I'm dealing with all this uncertainty in the future and all the risks that brings, the way to deal with it is by increasing prices now. Again, same sort of thing from probably when we engage with the consumers and consumer representatives from the other perspective. Again, this is just from our general engagement. They certainly have concerns about higher prices and what that's likely to mean. And they certainly have expectations about that reliability will be maintained, and very concerned if that was to get worse, and in some cases may want it to improve where they're willing to pay for that. But they really caution the Commission to always think about what would happen in a competitive market. And they have lots of examples about what happens in the businesses you guys, most of you, operate in, and what happens when these things happen. And it's usually around they don't have the same ability to be able to pass these costs through and prices to their consumers. We also get a lot of feedback about expectations about their suppliers innovating, and what should happen to those that don't. Basically, they're exposed to the consequences and get left behind, so to speak. So what does this mean for the Commerce Commission? In terms of the price quality paths, like I said, it's 2020 before we're going to be resetting them again once we get through to November this year. Therefore, a lot of this stuff is going to evolve between now and then, and the main avenue for this feeding into the Commission's work is the review of the input methodologies. So these were set back in December 2010, as Brent set out, but we also have an obligation to review them every 7 years. It's quite surprising how fast it seems to be coming around. And this review is due to be completed by the end of 2017. So I think this is probably the main mechanism for industry and ourselves feeding into how the regulation works, to ask ourselves, does it need to evolve to deal with some of these issues that the ones I've set out today, and I'm sure there's others, and there will be others that will be discovered between now and then. And fundamentally that will apply for the 2020 resets. And for this to happen, I think input from stakeholders is really key. Like I said, it's really on the monopoly businesses have the expertise about how their networks need to evolve. We're very much keen to hear views from all of industry about how these things should be taken account of, and ultimately for what it will mean in terms of price and quality for the end user. And just to reiterate around that engagement, like, you know, we really want to be connecting with all the stakeholders to get input for this process. We always try to be as clear and transparent as we can about our processes. Everything we do is on our website. Got the regulation branch email there if anyone would like to follow up on any of the stuff we discussed today. We set out in our calendar what's coming up in terms of what we're publishing and what's out for live consultation. And what we really want to see from the energy industry participants is, you know, giving consideration to these kind of issues we're seeing, including focusing on what some potential solutions are, and really active engagement with the Commission, basically not just our formal processes, but keeping us up to speed of where the thinking for the industry is evolving. So that was always looking to touch on today. I think we should have plenty of time for some questions.
Ralph.
Ralph Martis from Major Electricity Users Group. This isn't a question about cost of capital. My question is about the relationship between the Commerce Commission and the Electricity Authority. And I just wonder if you could explain that in relation to the Penrose substation fire and the inquiry the authority has been asked to undertake by the Minister, because I guess A large part of that inquiry should look at Vector's asset management plans and Transpower's asset management plans, and of course those are subject to Commerce Commission oversight. So, I mean, sort of how does it work, the relationship with the authority, and specifically with respect to the Penrose substation fire issue?
Yep, so in general we have a very close working relationship with the EA. We have a memorandum of understanding with them, and we have lots of basically catch-ups from board level to working level. So we're talking to them everything we do, because there's a number of areas where there are overlaps. I guess as the terms of reference for that Section 18 investigation would have been developed, we were asked for input to MB around what our rules would require and what impact potential compliance issues there would be around that. So obviously the terms of reference has been come out to the EA, and we've been chatting with them how we can assist them in undertaking their investigation. I think in terms of stuff like the asset management plans, which we have oversight for them, we don't particularly have any responsibilities on ensuring the AMP is a good AMP. All we do is making that information visible to people, whereas I think the terms of reference for the investigation is much more focusing around the substance of how good has their asset management been and how that interacts with the regulatory frameworks and the incentives they face. So I think it's quite a well-defined piece of work that we will...
You don't have quality control over the AMPs, does the EA?
In terms of quality control, it's up to the companies how good their AMPs are. But
You only find out if it's not good, if it fails.
no, I think in terms of the companies produce their AMPs, and they're available publicly for everyone to form their own views about the robustness of those asset management plans. What we would do for our summary analysis, we would make observations around whether we've got concerns about any of their performance around their asset management, but we don't have any obligation to require them to do anything specific about how they manage their assets. What we do is have standards around the quality they ultimately have to deliver. So it's very much focused on the outcomes, the outputs they deliver. But in order to help people understand where there's going to be future problems, it's about giving visibility to these asset management plans and putting them out for public scrutiny about how well these businesses are managing their network. So I think from our perspective, we're very comfortable around the processes we normally have to go through around disclosure compliance, and potentially if there does a breach of the quality path for Vector, we would have to investigate that under our normal processes. But we're just basically at the moment liaising with the EA about what we can help with in terms of feeding into their processes, particularly the piece around I think it was in the second or third bullet point around the regulatory framework and the incentives that apply to quality. So that's something that we'd definitely be feeding into their review.
John Kidd from Woodward Partners. Just a question around, yesterday at Context AGM we heard that they're spending 120 million more this year than they did last year on lines charges, spending something like $1 billion now. There's no, it costs money to get power to market, that's fine. And then this morning we hear the rebuttal from the lines company saying, well, it's not us, it's all smoke and mirrors. There's a weakness somewhere in understanding disclosure reporting analysis. Does the Commission have a view on its potential role in helping to address that?
I think there's a few different avenues. I think there's, I know that, and the EA is doing some work in this area as well. I think primarily our focus is on, say, something like the distribution businesses around the DPP, is making sure when we release our final decision, it's very clear what those impacts would be and what's actually going on. Unfortunately, the reality of doing a weighted average price cap is we're doing it at a very high level. You don't actually know what it will specifically mean for individual consumers. So unfortunately, us assigning average assumptions to it, you always find something will be different. So I think there's sort of two prongs on us about being very clear to disclose what will happen at the total level, what's happening with these businesses' revenue, which is probably what more that the energy retailers are interested in, what's their total costs doing, but also working with to make sure across the industry there is transparency about how these pricing changes are disclosed. And I know there's some specific work that EA are doing that around, making sure there's a well understood way of presenting how these changes are occurring. But I agree it's unhelpful. It has been happening over the last year or two when people have been pointing the finger at each other about who's to be blamed for increases or decreases. Unfortunately, in the world we live in at the moment, most of them have been increases. But it's not a simple thing, and unfortunately it gets lost in the averages, right? When you try and relate something that happens for a whole business level to what it will mean for individual consumers, which all have different demands and different tariffs and live in different parts of the country.
Yeah, Steve from Gas Industry Co, just picking up on that last point, what has been happening at our place is the phone's going and we're getting few inquiries saying, oi, my gas consumers are facing this or that price increase, and I've given them sort of a pigeon version of how that will involve, as John's pointing out, pass-through of pipeline costs. Two questions. Has the Commission's phone been going, and is there anything you've been able to share with individual consumers, given those uncertainties or variations you're talking about how your decisions actually play out?
Yep, I think there's two aspects to it. As you know, the Commission's wider than the regulatory, as Brent was setting out, so there is potential issues around whether businesses are putting out misleading information. So there's that avenue, and if we receive complaints in that area, we would be investigating them, something I'm not privy to given the area I work in. Under the regulation area, it's something we struggle with because we know that there's a lot of interest in us summarising in average what would be the outcome, but we know it'll be different for everyone. It can cause more problems about how it's perceived. So we do work quite closely with MB and the EA to get the balance right between revealing enough information that's useful to people, but not creating future problems that when people get their individual bill, it's all different and it doesn't cause everyone's phones to ring off the hook. So it is a bit of a balancing act. So there's not a lot we can do for individual consumers apart from point them in the right direction, whether it's for a complaint about being misled or to their retailer. Like I said, given how we regulate the businesses themselves, it's very much at a total level, so we can only estimate the average indicative impact for an average consumer. And that's the numbers that people are very interested in, and we're very cautious about how much of that we try to do because there's so many assumptions that have to go into it. It can be counterproductive if people pick up on it and realise that everyone's personal experience will be a bit different. I guess it's something we would welcome the feedback on, whether we should be doing more to estimate the average impact, or it's something we should steer clear away because it causes more concerns than solves problems.
Trevor D. Deloitte. Guys, I understand where you're at in terms of the timeframes around, I guess, the energy stuff and DPP and stuff. Before you go through the review methodologies, is there somewhere an assessment of cost-benefit analysis? In terms of what you've done over the last 7 years versus what, where you go to in the next 5 years?
Obviously that goes to the heart of how we would assess any changes, has to further improve the long-term benefits to consumers. So that's kind of a cost-benefit inherent in that. I think the cost-benefit of any policy refinement, it's not something for the Commission. We're not the policy makers. That's more central government or MB. So we can do assessments of whether there will be benefits for consumers, net benefits for consumers for making change of the regulations which we've got discretion within. But in terms of the cost benefit for changes to the regime is more a central government policy issue. But if you're asking about the stuff we've got control over, that's exactly the test we're applying. Will there be net benefits to consumers as a result of any changes over the long term? So it's not just, it's now and in the future. But as you can imagine, lots of the regulations, it's quite subjective. Doesn't naturally lend itself to having hard numbers necessarily all the time to do discounted cash flows on the benefits and costs. Yeah, it is interesting that regulation is a long game, and although it seems like quite a period of time has evolved since the Act was amended back in sort of 2008, in the case of the distribution businesses, this will be actually the first full 5-year price path where we reset both price and quality. So there's a mid-period one which was really only applying for a period of 2 to 3 years. We didn't look at quality. So although it's been in place for a while, it's still really now starting to reach the more sort of business as usual recurring type price path. And information disclosure is the same. You can't really assess, say, profitability of these businesses over just a 1 or 2 year period. So it will take time to build up that information, but the 7-year review will force a lot of that onto the table for what we know at that point.
Actually, Nick, I have a question. When you talked about some of the uncertainties that you laid out there, you obviously talked about the disruptive technologies and the so-called death spiral and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, that could actually have quite significant impacts in terms of the structure and form of the electricity distribution businesses and in fact the entire sector. But you kind of went, oh well, that'll be some other time post 2020, and it might be, but kind of just interested in how you're thinking about these things and how you might react if in fact we do get into that situation.
And I didn't mean it to be dismissive of the real issues that's faced by the sector. It's just we can only operate within the legal framework we have. So the only mechanisms we have are the price paths, which will now be set for 5 years. It's the input methodologies that underpin them, which will be reviewed in the next few years, and refinements to information disclosure. So maybe around information disclosure, we can help bring visibility to these emerging issues, and we can help push the companies to think about some of these things, but there's not a lot in our gift to influence them. We can only use the framework we have at our disposal. And I guess you're probably asking if some of these things, the potential impact could be so large, are they complete game changers? And that's not something, you know, we can only influence the rules which are in our authority to influence. And it does raise the wider question is, you know, are some of these things going to be game changers, or do we not know yet and we have to wait and see? And I think, you know, there is stuff happening right about the Smart Grids Forum. Some of these questions are getting on the table as a result of that piece of work. This sort of thinking is being developed in the UK and Australia and in America as well. Like we're not unique. There's probably some unique New Zealand issues, but these kind of things are being faced by distribution and transmission businesses all around the world.
I've been asked by John to say thank you to Brent and Nick for the presentation you've just given today, which is perhaps appropriate that I've been asked, given Contact's been in annual meetings been referenced a few times. And I was really pleased, Brent, that you sort of talked about the WACC and why it's being reviewed, because Contact has participated in that process. We have urged the Commission to do the review, and we've also suggested that a midpoint is a good point to settle on. And the reason we've done that is because we don't think consumers are well represented in that process. And I think perhaps the thing that if I reflect on the whole theme of today, I know it was a presentation to a business audience, but the role of consumers in your processes really does need to be thought about. At the annual meeting yesterday, the issue was, what are you doing to make sure that those numbers aren't so big and consumers are having to pay for them? We do try and participate. It is really quite hard. And I urge the Commission and business to think about what we can do about that. So thank you. I've also been told to tell you, please stay for lunch, everyone. John's overcated. Thank you very much.